The waters off St. Petersburg have now turned into a massive parking lot. Like trucks locked at a border crossing with their engines turned off, dozens of Russian oil tankers are trapped and waiting in the waters off St. Petersburg. They cannot move. This is not a storm or an accident. This is a trap. At the center of this trap is Vladimir Putin, paralyzed in front of his own castle while trying to defeat the West. And at the heart of this trap lie two emotions: money and fear. The new US sanctions that arrived on October 22nd burned the money. Putin's ghost ships suddenly lost their insurance policies and international port entry cards. Fear and panic. Ukraine's asymmetric attack threat, demonstrated in September against St. Petersburg, Primorsk and Orenburg, turned these ports, which Putin trusted most, into a huge shooting range filled with oil-filled, easy targets. St. Petersburg has never been just a city for Russia. Designed as Peter the Great's window to the West, this port city has been a symbol of Russia's economic power and strategic stronghold for centuries. Giant terminals in the Baltic Sea, such as Primorsky and Ust-Luga, were the heart of Russian oil exports, the economic lifeline of the empire connecting it to the world. But today, that window appears to have slammed shut. That strategic stronghold has now become a trap. Over 30 tankers are stranded outside the ports, unable to move. Putin's greatest economic strength had become his most vulnerable Achilles heel. The ships piling up in St. Petersburg's ports are not merely delayed cargo. For years, Putin has been attacking the West, hiding behind a strategy he calls the grey zone. He has launched cyber attacks, spread disinformation campaigns, and hinted at targeting undersea internet cables. The shadow fleet of over 600 rusty, uninsured tankers they built to evade sanctions was the darkest tool of this grey zone. Until now, these ships were merely ghosts carrying illegal oil, but not anymore. Now, they are Trojan horses, anchored in European ports, disguised as civilian cargo ships. And now, they are using a new form of threat: swarms of drones launched from civilian-disguised vessels. These attacks were low-intensity operations that the Kremlin could always deny, but the West could not easily respond to with direct military action. To September 24th to 25th, 2025. The goal was not to blind a radar station, but to blind a country's economic and logistical heart, to paralyze it. An emergency protocol similar to the COVA plan was immediately activated. This is the worst-case scenario an airport can face. All takeoffs were immediately halted. Dozens of planes approaching for landing began to circle dangerously in the air. The runways were cleared. Controllers in the tower tried to safely divert the planes in the air to other airports, while also trying to understand what the drones were doing. The result was complete chaos. Within hours, hundreds of flights were cancelled. Tens of thousands of passengers were stranded in terminals. The economic damage reached millions of euros within minutes. Cargo operations stopped, supply chains were disrupted, and Denmark's largest gateway to the world was shut down. But the real damage was psychological. The fact that a NATO capital, one of Europe's safest cities, could be held hostage for hours by such a simple and inexpensive method sent shockwaves across the continent. The Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and Vysotsk terminals are arteries that carry hundreds of millions of barrels of oil to the European market every year. When these lines are blocked, not only does the flow of foreign currency stop, but the Kremlin's internal balances also grind to a halt. Because 40% of Russia's budget still depends on energy exports, that is, on every barrel of oil that leaves the Baltic. However, more than 30 ships are anchored off St. Petersburg. Each carries between 500,000 and 800,000 barrels of oil. This translates to a daily loss of more than $20 million in revenue. And this money was supposed to go directly into the Kremlin's coffers. As the state's foreign exchange reserves dwindle, the ruble's value plummets. Another victim of this system is the oligarchs who manage shadow fleets. The Primorsk and Ust-Luga route has been under the de facto control of giants such as Lukoil, Sovcomflot, and Gunvor for years. These companies were making millions of dollars each time through the offshore ship chains they set up to evade sanctions. However, when ships stopped in the Baltic Sea, these oligarchs also lost their cash flow. For the Russian people, the picture is much, much bleaker. As the state's energy revenues decline, social budgets are being cut. Salaries cannot be paid, subsidies are being removed, and fuel prices are rising even domestically. The tankers waiting in the St. Petersburg port have become a symbol of empty pots in the kitchen for the people. not just a foreign trade issue. Because now, not only oil but also the regime's lifeline cannot leave those ports. This paralysis did not emerge overnight. It is the intersection of two massive geopolitical and military strategies designed to break Russia's economic backbone in the Baltic. To understand the anatomy of this suffocation, we need to examine these two pressure points separately. The first and most fundamental pillar of the crisis is the ever-expanding European Union and Western sanctions. The purpose of this fleet was to circumvent the price cap imposed on Russian oil by the G7 countries. Russia had turned these civilian-looking tankers into Trojan horses, not only to circumvent sanctions, but also to attack NATO. It became clear how dozens of kamikaze drones could be launched from a module placed on the deck of an oil tanker, looking like a standard shipping container. These ships were no longer just smugglers. They were floating terrorist bases capable of causing panic in European ports. Putin was now trying to win the war he couldn't win with his army, using pirate ships carrying oil. This was an act of terrorism. Its purpose was not only to cause disruption, but also to spread fear and a sense of vulnerability. The message, if this can happen in Copenhagen, it could happen tomorrow at Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, or Frankfurt, reverberated throughout all of Europe's capitals. Danish authorities were stunned, but red alerts were sounding at NATO headquarters in Brussels and at the intelligence services of member countries. Western intelligence services launched an intense investigation into who was behind this sophisticated attack. The timing of the attack, the choice of targets, and the technological profile of the drones used screamed of state intelligence and military planning. All fingers pointed to one address: Moscow. But there was a problem. The famous deniability veil that forms the basis of Putin's hybrid warfare doctrine. There was no concrete evidence that the attack had been carried out directly from Russian territory or a known military base. However, with the intelligence unit's discovery and the French special forces raid on the ship, everything suddenly came to light. Putin's plan was to sell this oil to the world, particularly to Asia, through a tanker network under his own control, outside of Western oversight. However, these new sanctions target not only the ships, but also the invisible network that enables them to move. Insurance. In international shipping, it is nearly impossible for a giant tanker carrying millions of barrels of crude oil to dock at any port or even pass through international straits without protection and indemnity insurance. The overwhelming majority of this high-risk insurance market is controlled by the London-based international group of P&I Clubs. The sanctions explicitly prohibit these clubs from providing insurance to any ship suspected of carrying Russian oil above the price cap, regardless of its flag. Putin's solution was to create companies offering Russia-backed, fake, or disreputable insurance policies. However, these shadow fleet vessels are typically over 15 to 20 years old, poorly maintained, and consist of tankers with questionable safety standards. This makes them a floating disaster risk in environmentally sensitive areas like the Baltic Sea. The West's latest move was even more astute: secondary sanctions. Now, not only insurance companies, but also port authorities that accept these ships, those that refuel them, or those that provide repair services, are being targeted. A port authority in China or India risks being cut off from the entire dollar-based financial system by accepting a suspicious Russian tanker. As a result, the shadow fleet has become a radioactive entity. The ships are trapped not by a physical military blockade, but by an invisible paper blockade. They have no insurance, cannot get repairs, and struggle to find ports to go to. One of the most striking examples of this crisis occurred in the last days of October. A tanker loaded with Russian crude oil bound for India unexpectedly changed course and began waiting in the Baltic Sea. The ship's name is Furia. According to satellite data, this tanker was heading west through the strait between Denmark and Germany when it suddenly changed course, traveled a short distance, then abruptly slowed down and stopped. Furia had departed from Russia's Primorsk port and was carrying approximately 730,000 barrels of Ural crude oil. This oil had been sold by the Russian state energy company Rosneft PJSC. The buyers were the private Indian refinery Reliance Industries Limited and the state-backed Bharat Petroleum Corporation, Ltd. The ship was headed for the port of Sikar in India's Gujarat state, with arrival planned for mid-November. But here's the problem. Although Reliance has a long-term contract to purchase Ural oil from Russia, it has stated that it is determined to comply with Western sanctions. This statement made it difficult for the Furia, carrying Russian oil, to find a port to unload its cargo. Thus, many tankers like this one were forced to wait offshore in the Baltic Sea. If sanctions are a legal and financial vice, Ukraine's technological asymmetry success is the steel arm tightening that vice. Kiev knew it couldn't fight Russia's Baltic Fleet ship for ship. It didn't need to. All it had to do was prove that even Russia's most valuable economic stronghold was no longer safe. Its weapons were long-range kamikaze UAVs capable of striking St. Petersburg. Now, apply this threat to the Gulf of Finland, the narrowest point of the Baltic Sea. This is a natural bottleneck. Tankers of the Shadow Fleet, forced to anchor outside terminals like Primorsky and Ust-Luga, are not military targets. They are sitting ducks. They are slow, have no maneuverability, and are completely devoid of the advanced air defense systems possessed by a warship. Pushing a ship that is already suspect due to sanctions into a proven attack zone, i.e., a giant firing range, this risk is uninsurable. Ukraine doesn't even need to launch an attack every day. The fact that the region is now an active war zone is enough to halt all trade. This is a risk blockade more effective than a physical blockade. Ukraine has held Russia's multi-billion-dollar annual oil trade hostage, using only the threat of drones costing a few $100,000. The system has been paralyzed in this way. In September and October 2025, the ports of St. Petersburg, Ust-Luga and Primorsk were targeted by Ukraine. 2 Shadow Fleet tankers were destroyed in the port. In addition, the St. Petersburg refinery was targeted twice and taken out of commission. The Krishi refinery was Russia's largest refinery and the main source of fuel for the Shadow Fleet. Now, even Russia's most important economic centers in the northwest were no longer out of range. When these historical data are brought together, it becomes clear that the reason for the current paralysis in the Baltic is not the threat, but the proven existence of the threat. The Baltic Trap is the result of months of careful and ruthless military operations. The immediate consequences of this Baltic Trap represent much more than a crisis for the Russian economy. They represent a state of complete strangulation. The effects are spreading like dominoes from the ports to the entire Russian economy. The first and most immediate effect is physical paralysis. A port like Primorsky is normally a high-tempo logistical marvel, designed to load millions of barrels of oil per day. This system relies on a constant flow of ships. One arrives, is loaded, and departs. But now, this conveyor belt has halted. When ships refuse to enter the port, or those already loaded are too afraid to leave, the system grinds to a halt. This bottleneck causes the massive oil storage tanks at the port to fill rapidly. When the tanks reach 100% capacity, the signal to send more goes to the pipelines. This is where the second domino falls. Major oil arteries, such as Russia's Baltic pipeline system, are forced to slow down or stop pumping. These pipelines carry oil from the West Siberian oil fields thousands of kilometers away to the Baltic. When these pipelines stop, the crisis spreads backward, and the refineries themselves are forced to slow down production, because their storage capacities are also filled to capacity. What appears to be a few ships waiting in port actually turns into a systemic failure that locks up the entire Russian oil export infrastructure. This logistical nightmare is immediately followed by economic bleeding. This is the moment when Putin's wallet is said to be torn. The Russian federal budget is chronically dependent on oil and gas revenues. These revenues are needed more than ever to finance the enormous costs of the war. Even the Russian Ministry of Finance's own data shows that energy revenues typically make up more than a third of the budget. The Baltic ports are the most important outlet for Russia's Urals-type crude oil exports. The paralysis of this system means the instant evaporation of hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue per day. This is not a delay that can be made up later. The war must be financed today. Missiles, artillery shells, and soldiers' salaries must be paid today. This choking off in the Baltic is a tourniquet applied to the main artery feeding the war machine. Putin's wallet is not just torn, it is actively bleeding. A third ripple effect is the Shadow Fleet itself. Buying, operating, and paying the crew for these ships cost billions of dollars. Now this fleet sits idle in the Baltic, generating zero revenue, burning fuel, and paying crew salaries. This ingenious solution, created by Putin to circumvent sanctions, has now become a massive financial burden in its own right, a floating junkyard of depreciating assets. The damage caused by this crisis goes far beyond Moscow's balance sheets. It strikes directly at the heart of Putin's geopolitical strategy. For the past few years, Vladimir Putin's entire foreign policy narrative, especially towards buyers in China, India, and other Asian countries collectively referred to as the Global South, has been built on a single promise. The West is unreliable, unstable, and politically driven. I, on the other hand, am your steadfast, reliable energy partner. This promise was the cement underpinning the BRICS+ vision. Russia was presented as a stable supplier that would never bow to the West's political games. With this paralysis in the Baltic, that promise has been shattered. The tankers stranded in that bay are not just filled with Russian oil. They are filled with oil that has most likely already been sold to refineries in India or China. The economies of these countries, just like Russia's, need a predictable and stable flow of energy. Now, their supplier, Vladimir Putin, cannot deliver what he promised. He cannot fulfill his most basic commercial obligations. This situation makes Putin look incredibly helpless and weak on the international stage. He cannot protect his own ships in his own backyard, in his own ports. He is helpless in the face of the threat posed by a handful of Ukrainian drones. This is the exact opposite of the image of a strong leader he has been trying to sell to the world. The defiant stance he has taken against the West since the beginning of the war is being ridiculed by the fact that his shadow fleet is stuck in the Baltic ice. His image is crushed. What follows is a flurry of diplomatic activity behind closed doors. We can imagine the angry and urgent phone calls coming from New Delhi and Beijing to Moscow. Where is our oil? This is not a show of force like the scenario where Poland cuts off China's trade route. This is an admission of helplessness, with Putin holding no cards. He is forced to apologize, make excuses, and perhaps offer large discounts for future deliveries. This is precisely where the process of allies turning their backs begins. India and China are not Russia's friends. They are pragmatic partners. They bought Russian oil because it was cheap and plentiful. Now that oil is cheap but unreliable. An unreliable supplier is an economic burden. This situation is forcing Beijing and New Delhi to put their eggs in different baskets. Quietly, they will have to return to their other suppliers in the Middle East. Even if these suppliers are more expensive, at least they offer a guarantee of delivery. This is not only an economic loss, but also a diplomatic collapse. This loss of reputation and trust could be far more devastating in the long run than the lost oil revenues. Putin has shown that he is not a master of the energy chess game, but a pawn trapped by Ukraine's asymmetric moves. The final act in Putin's tragedy is how this external stranglehold directly fuels chaos within Russia's borders. The bigger picture is the acceleration of the collapse of the home front. The crisis in the Baltics is like a piece of shrapnel exploding inward toward Russia. First, the money issue. The paralysis in the ports is opening a hole of tens of billions of dollars in the Russian budget. How will the Kremlin plug this hole? It cannot borrow from international markets due to sanctions. That leaves only two options: print money or tax its own people more. Printing money leads to one place: hyperinflation. The Russian central bank is already struggling with high interest rates to keep double-digit inflation under control. Printing more worthless rubles will devalue the currency, and every Russian citizen will feel this every time they go to the market. The second option, raising taxes, is political dynamite. Imposing more VAT on a war-weary population and additional war taxes on businesses dynamites Putin's 25-year implicit social contract. The promise of, "Don't get involved in politics, I'll give you stability," loses its meaning when that stability is gone. The chokehold in the Baltic traps crude oil that should be exported within the country. At first glance, one might think, if they can't export it, won't they have more oil for the domestic market? No, the system doesn't work that way. Russia's refinery infrastructure is rigid. The complex atmospheric vacuum distillation units that produce high-octane gasoline and diesel are facilities targeted by Ukraine, dependent on Western technology, and difficult to replace due to sanctions. Facilities that only process crude oil for export cannot easily be converted to produce gasoline for the domestic market. Complete chaos. Reports are increasing of massive queues at gas stations, not only in border areas but deep within Russia. Farmers cannot find diesel to plow their fields. Trucks cannot deliver food to markets. This is not a simple inconvenience. It is the beginning of a systemic collapse. This is the psychological breaking point. A soldier on the front lines, fighting in Ukraine, hears that his family back home can't find gas or is freezing, and his morale collapses. An ordinary Russian citizen sees that his country, marketed as an energy superpower, can't provide gas to its own citizens, and the Kremlin's victory propaganda rings hollow. Putin is now fighting on two fronts, one against Ukraine, the other against his own people's growing anger and helplessness. In St. Petersburg, those tankers stranded in the Gulf of Finland are not just a logistical problem, they are the wreckage of Putin's energy superpower narrative, a ship taking on water and sinking. Instead of an expensive navy, Ukraine seems to have blocked Russia's historic window to the west by using a smart, asymmetric, and patient strategy. Putin's wallet has been torn, his fleet is trapped in the Baltic, and his credibility among his allies is being questioned. The Baltic trap could be one of the most serious dead ends on the Kremlin's economic war map. Thank you for choosing us.